I'm going to start and just begin with a very big welcome. Really appreciate people from all around the world dialing in to join us today. I know this is a conversation that people really want to be part of, and we're thrilled to have so many wonderful friends as well as some new faces joining us today. So thank you very much for making the time to join us on Leaders Link. But I think I know most people here, but for those that don't know me, my name's Lindsay Levin. I'm the founder and leader of Leaders Quest. Our work is all about aligning purpose and profit and trying to help shape a better future. And we're going to talk about a very difficult part of life today and really focus this conversation on racism and racial equity and social justice. And I'm thrilled in a moment to fully introduce you to my two guests, Jimmie and James. Before I do that, I just want to say a little bit about this Leaders Link. So we do these weekly calls. A number of you are regulars on the calls. We try to talk about very topical issues, and we take the time to meet with people who've got something really valuable and special to say about some of the big challenges that exist in the world today. We're all, I think, pretty much every city and place that I see represented right now, one way or another, you are experiencing some of the civil unrest that we're seeing sparked here in the US, running right around the world. An incredible uprising, really, of voices, including many people who probably haven't been involved in many of these discussions before. And so we're at an extraordinary moment, I think, to be having this conversation. For some folk, it's, I'm sure, something they feel they've spent their entire lives talking about with no progress. And maybe for some, there's a sense that perhaps we're at a different moment and that we have an opportunity to turn this into real and meaningful action, and that every one of us has a place to play in that and a role to play. And that's very much the spirit of this conversation. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining. I want to introduce you now to Jimmie and James, who are going to share this conversation with us. Jimmie Briggs is a colleague in Leaders Quest, one of our associates. He's a principal at the Skoll Foundation. He's an award-winning journalist and writer. He wrote a book in 2005 called Innocence Lost: When Child Soldiers Go to War. The current project, one of the current projects he's working on right now, is an oral history of Ferguson, Missouri, in the wake of Michael Brown's death there in 2014. And for any of you who haven't yet read his piece in Vanity Fair of a couple of weeks back on the current situation in the US, I would highly recommend it. We'll speak a little bit about that today. So Jimmie, thank you so much for joining us today. Really happy to have you with us. He's led a number of Quest programs with us. And Jimmie's actually also going to join me to co-host a series of these conversations on these particular topics going forward. So big welcome to you, Jimmie. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And our other guest today is James Feagin. James is born and raised in Detroit. He's been a fantastic host for us in Detroit, one of the people who's helped us on Quest to understand his city, to understand some of the challenges of that city, some of the incredible opportunities. He works there as an urban practitioner. His work in he's CEO of an organization called Projects+PEOPLE, and his work is all about creating opportunity, creating equity in the city, helping support an ecosystem that is entrepreneurial, channeling capital flows to get behind people who are often excluded from society in different ways. And so James, thrilled also to welcome you. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to be part of this conversation.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna hand quickly actually to the two of you, and maybe start with you, James, and then move to Jimmie. Bearing in mind you've got people here, quite a lot of Americans or American-based, US-based people on the line, but also people from other parts of the world. Could you just share in your own words, what is going on right now in the US in particular?
Well, aside from us taking away syrup and rice from people, a few other things. And what I'll do, I'll work to be brief and try to be succinct, but you have kind of a collision, as I'm sure all astute people are aware, you have a collision of several things at once. There is, the precipice of right now is, what we all saw on video about a month ago, the murder of George Floyd. and then the subsequent kind of systematic playing out of that, where there was, initially no arrest, there was a response, kind of the playbook that went into play of how the legal system and the criminal justice system responds to these interactions, which only inflame things. The difference this time was that because the world was not going on as usual, a lot of folks who might not normally pay attention didn't have their routine to distract them from what happened. So, we don't really have data points on exactly how many more people saw this murder because it was filmed who would normally not only see it, and how many folks would then had time to mentally digest it because they weren't busy. And, I also think that in addition to the racial component of this, something that Americans aren't experiencing here domestically is you had large, high levels of short-term unemployment, which gave a lot of folks, and not just short-term unemployment in like an interim, but a lack of hope about what they were going back to. The health anxiety, the economic anxiety, some of the other things that have been building up for a long time just really kind of added up to, I think, a lot of people saying like, wait a minute, what the hell is really going on here? And I think that's the part, that has all come together, where it's not just the usual suspects who are outraged as the world goes on. The world's not going on, and a lot more other people are forced to kind of confront this and take a position in the way that they normally have. And then, just as the mob mentality or social pressures can work in one way, it's kind of worked in the other, where you can't not have an opinion on what happened, which is forcing a lot of folks, the good middle that sits on the sidelines, to kind of declare their goodness outwardly in a way that they normally get to just kind of live with internally. And it's exposing a lot of other things. That's the short answer of it.
Fabulous. Thank you, James. And Jimmie, you've spent much of your career, a piece of your writing has been on all these topics. You've been through so many of these murders and these kinds of situations. What would you add to what James has said in terms of what your description of what's going on right now?
Thank you, Lindsay. First of all, I think James is spot on. Everything he said, I want to hold it up and just, co-sign it, plus one it. I mean, I totally agree with it. I've been wondering the past few weeks myself, Lindsay and James, if not for COVID and the shelter in place that we're seeing globally, would George Floyd's murder have just been another notch in the tally of Black men who've been killed, men of color who've been killed by law enforcement officers in this country? I think, to be honest with you, I wrestled with this in my Vanity Fair piece that you referenced, Lindsay, but also in talking with friends and colleagues and my family. I think, this is part of a long overdue reckoning, grounded in race in America, but also grounded in I think, just a broad systemic inequality, because, this narrative, it may be focused right now on the lives of Black men, Black people, Black Americans, but it's one I think that really crosses ethnicities and race, especially in the American narrative, when you're talking about Indigenous and Native Americans who are largely invisible in the midst of COVID-19.
Have we just lost the sound? Can everybody hear Jimmie?
No.
No, we've lost your sound, Jimmie.
I think he's frozen because his video.
Okay.
Here's.
No activity.
Okay. Whilst we wait for Jimmie to come back, I'm gonna turn, James, to a piece that you wrote on your Facebook page that really caught my attention. Do you mind if I quote from that and just read a little bit out? Would that be okay with you? So James wrote a piece just a little while back, and I'm going to read for you and share a little bit of what he said, because I think it speaks to some of what many of us are experiencing and feeling, and I'm just reading a couple of extracts. James wrote, I'm seeing people take steps today that they've never taken before to attempt to speak to how they're feeling and how they see the injustice personified by George Floyd's murder. I won't grade you on your imperfect words or lament about what you did or didn't do yesterday. Today, I acknowledge your effort and your intent. I give space to those who say it's not our job to teach white people how to be allies, or those who are too exhausted, angered, frustrated, or drained from the work or from simply existing to invest the time in such conversations. But somewhere in this fight, someone has to value the seed of potential for a changed mind and what it can become. So today, as my brothers and sisters continue the fight, as we continue to mourn and be rightfully angry, I choose to see beauty in some of what I've seen and heard. From officers kneeling to friends acknowledging that they can no longer be complicit, to many people asking for the first time, what can I do and how can I be better? James, first of all, deep appreciation for that piece. I think it was, it certainly spoke to many of us. It circulated amongst a lot of my friends as we read what you had to say. Welcome back, Jimmie. We'll chime back into you in just a moment.
Thank you. Okay.
Great that you're there. But perhaps just expand a little bit on that, because in part, and Jimmie's article, which we'll speak about in a moment, was directly addressed to his white friends, and that's an important context that we're sitting in here as white friends talking to both of you. Perhaps just expand a little bit, James, on your own feelings as you put that piece down in writing.
I mean, my first feeling, I just have to say, wow, I should have you read everything I ever write because you make it sound so profound. It's also a bit surreal to me. I'm grateful, but it's surreal to be on this call and be paired with someone who writes professionally and has contributed to Vanity Fair. I don't consider myself a writer. And honestly, that post was just something that was going on in my head at the time, and I hadn't really said much publicly. So it wasn't, you know, I've never really actually invested the time to put thoughts together in a way that I thought might actually be publishable or, you know, any of that. So it's interesting. In terms of why I kind of shared that or what I was thinking, the burden and the blessing of my upbringing is that I've both lived in all Black environments and I've lived in environments where I was the only Black person. And so you get enough experience with the good and the bad and the ugly of pretty much every type of person to be fortunate enough to see character across a spectrum of cultures and backgrounds. And so it just kind of gives me a lens from which I look at life that doesn't, for lack of a better terms, doesn't really allow me to see things in black and white. And so I think that while there's a part of me that can live in the part of this, where I said I give space to folks who don't have time. We are angry that, as Jimmie said, this is just another notch on the post. You know, George Floyd is not the most perfect martyr we've had. You know, I've seen some folks who talk about, you know, is this the person that you should be highlighting, or as though there's some board of Black people that gets together and decide which person is going to be murdered by police. It's actually part of the systematic racism we're talking about, where when people feel that certain folks are disregardable, then they are easier victims. You know, just as you could correlate it to sexual assault, and not to trigger anyone, you know, people try to degrade people's character to justify their behavior. And so you'll see often, you know, it's someone that might have been suspected of committing a crime, or someone who would appear to have certain means, or someone who, you know, whether it's in the act or definitely after the fact, the dead Black body is often put on trial. And we've seen that play out over time and time again. What I hadn't seen, which was different this time, were people who, like I said, I've got some white friends that I can look back at our Facebook messages or our text messages, and they check on me after every tragedy. You know, there were people who I had never had these types of conversations with who were either reaching out or who were expressing publicly, this is wrong. And it's people who I know enough about to know that, like, that's going to cost them socially. They were making a conscious decision to move beyond the comforts of their normal social construct and take a stand, which I could extrapolate the personal work that went into that. And then even as you saw a lot of the totalitarianism happening with police and protester clashes, there were also a lot of beautiful small human moments that I were seeing where there were good folks that were getting lost in the narrative or the playbook that we all go to when these things happen. There's the outrage, which then turns into behavior that folks don't feel is constructive. And then there's the heavy-handed response to that. And there's folks that say, well, you know, the protesters shouldn't do this because it gets lost in the message. And then we just all going back to life. But within all of that, there were people showing up to the front lines of the fight, whether it was vocally, whether it was actually starting to protest, that just signaled that something different was happening and that wasn't being talked about at a national level and in my immediate circle. And I just wanted to acknowledge that moment.
Right. Thank you, James. Thank you very much. Jimmie, welcome back. I want to speak a little bit now, if we may, about your article, which was called "I'm Not Okay, a Black Journalist Addresses His White Friends." Do you mind, Jimmie, if I read a couple of bits of the article? Because, of course, a lot of people on the line won't have read it, and I'd just love to set a bit of context, if you don't mind. Is that okay with you?
Sure. Thank you, Lindsay.
So part of what Jimmie wrote: I, like many Black friends, colleagues, and family members, have heard from an array of people in our lives, mostly well-meaning white people. For myself, the outreach has been in the form of text messages asking, "Are you okay?" or "How are you all and the baby doing?" In recent days, communications have had an air of greater urgency with an added, "Please stay safe," or "Hope you are inside and away from the outside." While I deeply appreciate the expressions of love, affirmation, and care, and I do cherish my relationships with those who've reached out, I'm more interested in posing a question to them. Are you okay? And then you go on to say, at first, white angst and outrage at the killing of George Floyd had been inspiring. But as the days have passed, these responses have become distasteful, bemusing, and untenable. To the white people marching in cities across America, as well as those hand-wringing in places of worship at home or in workplaces, I ask, where have you been? Incredibly powerful, Jimmie. I think it's a wonderful article that you shared with us, and I'd just love you to say a little more, especially given the particular audience that you know Leaders Quest, you know the kind of folk who are here, and a lot of us know that you're addressing us in that article. So we'd love to hear a little bit more from you.
Thank you again, Lindsay, and thank you again, James. I'm dealing with, a while ago I was dealing with the issues of connectivity around being outside of New York City in the woods. So I'm sorry about that. I think, you know, I was listening to James's words, and I think, I mean, having not met each other before this call, I feel like we're so simpatico, you know, as Black men and Black Americans particularly. I mean, what motivated me to write that piece, and you know, I remember writing it, I wrote it like in 2 or 3 hours one morning after my baby daughter, after I put her down for bed and my partner was asleep, I put her down in the crib and I just wrote that. And I think it was really kind of a dichotomy of feelings. On one hand, I said I was very inspired, and I'm still inspired even by this call. You know, while James was talking, I was listening, but also kind of perusing, you know, the postage size images on my computer. You know, so I'm very encouraged, you know, by the activism, especially that we've seen domestically and globally around the world. At the same time, I have to confess, it's very bittersweet, and the bitterness kind of drove that piece because, you know, I feel like this conversation, this reckoning, this visibility, this witnessing is over 500 years too late, you know? You know, I feel like tens of thousands of Black women, men, children, boys and girls have been killed by law enforcement, by fellow and sister citizens, by the system of white supremacy we live under in this country, and I would say even globally. And I just, you know, it's like, you know, as James said, I just, you know, how many more bodies have to be fed in this machine? And, you know, because of that, I guess a part of me, and I was saying before, when I got cut off before, part of me, writing those words, Vanity Fair, you know, I want to say to my friends and colleagues, my coworkers, my family, I have white family members, you know, to say harshly, but from a place of love, I need you to look in the mirror. I need you to look in the mirror, because as a middle-aged Black man, you know, your survival depends on getting through months like this. You know, I wouldn't be alive at this point if I did not have the toolkit to get through another Black man who was my peer and my generational peer, another Black man being killed by law enforcement. You know, I think, you know, as a writer and as someone who loves literature, you know, I think about, you know, people like Claude McKay or Langston Hughes or Countee Cullen or writers of the Harlem Renaissance who wrote about things like this so eloquently. I mean, I was saying in an interview last week with someone, you know, it's a very strange thing, because, you know, for a person of color, whether you're African American, Indigenous American, Latinx, Asian American, if you're a non-white person who grew up in this country, you know, you not only grow up understanding and learning American history, specifically white American history, and if you're lucky, you learn your own history as well. But you have to learn the history of the narrative. You have to learn the narrative that's taught to you in schools and popular society, because your survival depends on that. But, you know, what's interesting now, we're seeing, you know, if you look at Amazon, you look at Netflix, you look at Hulu, you look at PBS, you look at the New York Times, Washington Post, you know, so many articles, so many movies from throughout the portfolio of films made by and for Black Americans in this country are now being presented. Books about, you know, anti-bias, anti-racism work, like White Fragility or How to Be an Anti-Racist are now bestsellers. And it's interesting now that, you know, I guess it's intriguing to me now that, you know, we've lived our whole lives understanding how to navigate America, particularly white America, and the sensitivities of white America at large. But now, for the first time, because of George Floyd's death, now the rest of the country has to learn our history, has to learn our pain, our trauma, has to learn our narrative. And it's inspiring to see that happen. But the thing is, you know, America cannot read its way out of this, cannot watch, I don't care how many movies you watch on Netflix, Amazon Prime, or how, you know, how many, you know, how many PBS specials you watch. We cannot, you know, this moment was going to be stretched out for many years, because it took us over 500 years to get here. And I think, you know, I think this is a conversation, this is work that has to happen over generations. And I don't think ours is going to live to see it, and I don't think our grandkids are going to live to see it, but I think it's a step towards the healing, and I would say maybe the realization of what America was meant to be all along.
Fabulous. I feel normally we keep on speaking for a little while longer before we open to comments and questions, but I actually feel it's an appropriate moment, not for questions actually, but just for any comments. And I just want to invite those of you who are on the line. It's not a moment to ask a question. We're actually being asked, lots of us in different ways, in our different circumstances and different places that we come from in the world, to do this looking in the mirror. And so I just want to hold a little bit of a space for anybody who wants to just share something. And if you want to do that, just raise your hand in the, it's in the participant function. You can raise your hand. You just hit that little raise hand sign. And let's just take a moment. If we're a little silent for a while, there's nothing wrong with that either, but let's just take a moment to reflect on what's going through each of our minds and hearts, and see whether anybody has something they'd like to say. You can also put something in the chat if you wish. Valerie from Paris would love to hear from you, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
You're a bit faint. Maybe hold the mic up.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jimmie, James, and Lindsay. So I have 2 points. I'll try to be as concise as possible. The first one is building on your point, acknowledging that maybe this time the murder of George Floyd sparked something bigger because people were not usually as busy. It, to me, makes a lot of sense. I also think that this incredible parallel between the contagiousness of the virus and the contagiousness, if that word exists, of the outrage when seeing those images of George Floyd are actually an incredible parallel. And I think it might be also due to the fact that because of the virus, people were already in a pretty rough, raw, difficult existential situation that makes us all a bit more sensitive. You know, in French, we say à fleur de peau. It's really like on our skin. It's really very sensitive. That's just one comment. The second comment is something I'm struggling since many, many years because I am from mixed ethnic background. And it's the word race. I have a very, very profound dislike of that word. And I have difficulty using it, and I read it everywhere. And I just wonder, without quibbling about semantics, it's not the idea. I'm just wondering if you have an opinion about whether this word used as if they were different races when there is not, if this word is not actually perpetuating an issue, perpetuating the false belief that there are different races. And somewhat, there is also a systemic issue in the language and whether we just need not to ban the word, but to look for a word that is more accurate, that stop people maybe thinking that they are different races. I don't know if that makes sense.
Wonderful. Before I pass back, is there anybody else who'd like to share a comment? Encouraging people to be courageous as well here. Cristina, please go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you all of you for this. This is a really wonderful place to listen and to learn. Racism has always been a big thing for me, and I get emotional thinking about it. And I have been trying to do something for many years. In one of the last killings in the US, I tried to see if I could get in touch with the police there to see if I could somehow help train the police. Of course, never got through to that. But what I'm noticing in the last few weeks is whites are often very scared to talk about this. Sorry, it's a bit noisy out here. I've had several forums where I suggest we create a conversation, and the response I get from my white colleagues or the people I'm working with is, who are we to create a conversation? But then I've had some other participants who are Black or who are colored, and they're saying, why are we not talking about this? So I'm noticing a tension between, you know, some people feeling, how would I ever be adequate to it? But on the other side, and it may be different for each of you, a longing for some of those conversations to happen, and also exhaustion around them.
Thank you, Cristina. Let's pass back. James, do you want to comment a little bit on what's been said? Please go for it.
I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I actually made some notes.
Yes, in the chat. Thank you.
The first, just going back very briefly to something Jimmie alluded to, just within African Americans, there's a full spectrum of thought on this, and there's a lot of Black people that woke up too. You know, we all have lifestyles and identity that we've built as coping mechanisms to this. Some of us become full-time activists, some of us turn to God, some of us turn to capitalism, some of us pour ourselves into our work. We all have this, you know, once you become conscious and aware of what's going on in the world, you know, our way to overcome it. You know, some folks become officers, some folks become politicians and believe that becoming president, you know, will allow them to change the world. We've kind of seen how that works out or doesn't. You know, some folks become billionaires. Some folks just say, I'm just going to make money and take care of my family. None of it has worked, you know, so I'll just leave that there for now. The other thing, to respond to Valerie's observation about race, it brought up a couple of interesting things for me. One, about the actual origin of police forces in America, which when you look back were originally like groups of paid folks that went to catch runaway slaves. So I get in a lot of trouble with my friends when I have my intellectual hat on and I say that, you know, slavery in itself was a business decision. Someone didn't sit around and say, I'm gonna go out and get those people because I don't like them. They just said, we got these fields, we can't pick all this shit, we need laborers. And they went and got laborers. They couldn't get the Native Americans to do it. They couldn't get other folks to do it. So they had to go get labor. And subjugated labor forces are a part of the history of our economy. The other things that then come into play to maintain that often involve race. So whether you talk about slave catching or the way that slaves were pitted against each other, the construct of whiteness as you come out of slavery to maintain a feeling of superiority over folks that were now free, which you see all coming out to play today. And then coming back to my day-to-day work, because again, I'm not a scholar. My work in Detroit is around small business work. So to go back in terms of how COVID had exposed rawness and inequity, the health outcomes, which we're now coming to understand, the real human toll of that, which I understand because I'm sitting here living it now, when I know the friends and family that I've lost, and very few of my white friends can count on one hand someone that they know who's died. To my specific work in Detroit over the last 6 years, where I worked to help open and grow a couple hundred small businesses. When we were doing that work, the pools of capital and resources that were available to us, SBA, the Small Business Administration for folks, lay people, was not even on that list because the data has just shown that historically SBA loans, 91% of SBA loans go to white male-led businesses. This is pre-COVID. So then when the government decides that this is going to be the mechanism by which they push out resources to support small businesses, and 75% of my businesses that I've supported with $15 million in grants over the last few years and millions of dollars in technical assistance are led by people of color, and the majority women of color, you have that's the definition of structural racism in terms of the disconnect that now does not allow these businesses to participate in something that's supposed to save all folks. And then literally Memorial Day weekend was my first weekend off in 3 months, where I took a break. And Monday afternoon, I watched a murder at the hands of a former slave catching force police officer that now sends us into a place where if you just laid that out on a graph of, you know, and one of my lenses is economic equality, right? So if I start the year off feeling good about finally making some headway on economic equality, and then we get to March, we have a pandemic, Black people die at a higher rate, Black businesses fail at a higher rate, and then now you have a murder to where I don't even remember what I was fighting for 4 months ago of trying to reestablish the catching up on the Black wealth gap, which you've identified, and the work that Andre Perry has done around the $656 billion in undervaluing of Black neighborhoods. I'm now just, again, having to ask if people can agree with me that Black lives matter. So where does the economic equality come from? Where do the health disparities get addressed? Where do the policy things get addressed? If we're literally now having a debate about the right to survive. That for me, because I'm not a scholar, I'm not a writer, I don't even consider myself an activist. The fact that this year will be defined not by economic gains, but by pleading for survival, that to me lays out the real challenge and inequity.
Thank you, James. Jimmie, let's bring you back into the conversation. What would you like to share based on what you've just been listening to, or indeed anything else you want to put into the discussion now or ask of us?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I love that James took it to the economic systems analysis. I think that's critical. I think often we talk about racism, quote unquote racism, this broad kind of amorphous specter. As I so appreciate him, like, especially given his work in Detroit and beyond. And the economic factor throughout this country's history is critical because slavery was a business from which many people benefited on this continent and others. I think, Lindsay, for me, and you know me, and the LQ team knows me, I think the way I think is highly intersectionally and globally, and especially recognizing that we have a very multinational audience in this conversation. I just think for me, it's worth noting two things. One, I actually wrote this in response to Valerie and Cristina, but I think just really kind of acknowledging that, this type of state violence, if you will, against men of color in the American situation, I think it has such profound resonance globally. I think there's a recognition, frankly speaking, in London and Paris, throughout Europe, throughout the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, even in Asia, where, to Valerie's point, race, as we define it here in the West or in the United States, it's not really it's not the same framework. And equity and equality means something very different in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, or Asia than it does in the U.S. context. So I just want to note that I think one of the things we have to do as a caring community, because I feel like everyone on this call, the fact you're on this call, you're a caring community, I think we have to really understand, come up with a universal definition of equity. And in that way, we can talk about what the American context of oppression and disenfranchisement alongside what happens in India, or what happens in Paris or London, or what happens in the Americas. And the other thing too, and this is kind of more a spiritual reckoning I've been confronting lately, about a week after George Floyd was murdered, I was with my family, my youngest daughter and partner, driving from Florida to New York, and we were driving through South Carolina. I was on a call for work, and the call got disconnected because I was in a dead zone for my cell services, and it was the perfect timing for my phone call to die, because as we were driving through this part of South Carolina, we were passing a stretch of plantations, and it just really hit me hard that kind of echoing what I said before, we have to deal with where we are right now. We have to look ahead to a so-called or quote-unquote colorblind future, imagine that future and hopefully realize it. But at the same time, as we're looking ahead, we have to look back and really reckon with what's been lost, reckon with the oppressions, the trauma, because I think it kind of ties in what James was saying. And I think for those who live in countries or have experiences where there's been national unrest or disruption, I think right now we're all globally going through disruption with COVID, but where you have this intergenerational trauma. And I think that's the piece that has to be understood, because, unlike indigenous or similar to indigenous and Native Americans in this country and Canada, I think, Americans descended from enslaved Africans in this country, you've had centuries of intergenerational trauma, where the trauma of slavery, the trauma of Jim Crow, the trauma of failed Reconstruction, the trauma of the civil rights movement in the 50s to the early 70s, the trauma of the war on drugs in this country, the trauma of the war on COVID-19 right now in this country. I think these layers of oppression and trauma have led us to a point where, and James Baldwin writes about this, wrote about this extensively in his lifetime, but it's almost to a place now where Black Americans almost have come to accept that we deserve what's happening to us. That we've almost come to accept that this is our reality, this is our fate. I think for me, the power and opportunity of this moment right now is to disrupt that narrative, that this is not our fate, that this is not meant to happen, that we don't deserve what's happened to us over the past 500 plus years since slavery came to the shores of this country. And in turn, I think there has to be a connection with the intergenerational trauma here, for what we saw, and they're still seeing it, frankly speaking, and those countries on the world that were colonized, then decolonized. Yeah. Because I think in those situations, I'm thinking South Asia, I'm thinking sub-Saharan Africa. I'm thinking parts of the Americas. I think, you know, the systems of inequity and oppressive economic conditions, health conditions, are the direct result of that intergenerational trauma caused by systemic, or caused by white supremacy, caused by colonialism, and caused by patriarchy.
Thank you, Jimmy. I'd love to bring Lucy in. Lucy, if you come off mute, I know you've got a comment or a question to share. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you very much for organizing this. James and Jimmy, your comments are spot on, and I appreciate it. There's one population that has not really been discussed, and I work very closely on an ongoing and regular basis, typically volunteering, and it is the people who are in prison coming out of prison. And this is not true in Europe, but we have a huge prison population in the United States, and probably 60% or better are Black and brown people. And James, I applaud you for what you're doing with starting new businesses, because one of the things that we do, and in fact, I'll be doing it tonight on a Zoom call, and I do it twice a week, every week, is we work with people who have come out of prison and they can't get jobs, many of them, because they've got felony records, and we are teaching them how to be entrepreneurs. It's an extensive, you know, many week program, but we teach them how to write a business plan, et cetera, and get money. But this is a population that is often ignored. And even, of course, the prisons are closed right now because of COVID, so I'm not going inside, but I've been in virtually every prison in Connecticut, as well as some federal prisons as well. And, you know, I see the, and most of what they call the COs, the correctional officers, I'd say 90% of them are white. And then most of the prisoners are Black and brown. And to me, it's gut-wrenching, because that's also the heart of racism, when you see how these people are treated. And then once they come out, they can't get housing. They can't get Section 8 housing if they have a felony. They're cut off from food stamps, the SNAP program, because of a felony. And so, you know, it just self-perpetuates more and more crime. If you can't get a job, if you can't get your basic needs met, Maslow's, you know, hierarchy of needs, if you can't get your basic needs met, what are you going to do? So consequently, I see that as something that has not been as well addressed as I would like to see addressed. This whole, you know, social hierarchy of the judicial system. We talk about the police, but we don't talk about the judicial system as much.
So I would just really echo that, Lucy. One of the things that Leaders Quest has done a lot of in the US is understanding mass incarceration here and spending time in prisons and with communities of folk who've come out and are trying to get by. And I completely echo what you're saying. It is absolutely staggering, this lifetime sentence, often having had a very poor shot at justice in the first place. It's an extraordinary scandal. It's just unbelievable. So I completely concur with what you're describing. I don't know whether either James or Jimmy want to comment a little bit on what Lucy said.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. There's definitely a connection, and it's twofold. The first is, you know, policing as it exists right now, and I just shared this in the comments, it's the feeder system for the prison industrial complex. And so when you talk about the prison industrial complex and the institutional racism surrounding it at every level, it's
Yeah, keep going.
It's invested in, to the point where, you know, when you really get to the root of what, you know, defund the police, from my perspective, is all about, it's at some point we had to recognize that the war on drugs was BS, and we weren't going to win it by arresting drug dealers and arresting addicts. We seem to have found that sympathy when white folks got hooked on meth. Now, you look at the prison industrial complex, And the entire criminal justice system has served two functions. Number one, if you go back from culturally to the birth of a nation, fear of this savage that was going to kick down your door and violate you, which, by the way, is the same rhetoric that, I won't say his name, our country's current person in power just recited at this past weekend's rally. He literally, you stoked that fear in the same way that went right back like he was reading the script from the movie. You have that aspect of the fear. Then you now have this multi-billion-dollar industry that has gone from a cost burden of the states and the government to say it's in our best interest to lower these costs and to recidivize these people, or to recuperate these people so that we can put them back as productive members of society. If the state ran the prisons, and the state would say, it's in our best interest to lower this portion of our budget. Now, because people can literally invest in prisons and profit from prisons and have a fully vertically integrated supply chain where I run a juvenile detention center, I fail to recuperate a kid as a juvenile, so then I get him as a prisoner. I have cops that are gonna make sure that they arrest him for every time he jaywalks or spits out gum, and I've got a customer for life. And I can profit from that, and I can lobby to make sure that even if I build a jail, if the bed is empty, the state's gotta pay me anyway for that bed. So now you have budgets that go toward prisons and not toward schools and the other things that actually lower that incarceration rate. That's the definition of the structural racism that defund the police is trying to attack, to say we need to shift our priorities.
David Hill, let me just bring you in. I've seen you've got a raised hand. Where's David? Want to come off mute? No, if you're there, we can't hear you. I see your raised hand. Okay, I'm gonna, if you come off mute in a moment, we'll bring you in, but I'm just gonna keep going and come back to a couple of last questions, and we've got a further 10 minutes with each of James and Jimmie. Jimmie, I wanted to ask you about the choice of work that you've pursued. You know, you've written about incredibly difficult subjects. Child soldiers probably doesn't get much harder than that. You're writing now about Ferguson. You've written about many of these issues. Perhaps you could share with us a little bit about your own kind of motivation and also what it takes in terms of your own personal sustainability. Oh, is that David?
Sorry, I finally managed to find.
Let me just, David, I'm just going to finish this question for Jimmie, and then we're going to bring you in, okay? So I'm glad you're off mute. We'll stay off mute, and we'll bring you in just a minute. So Jimmie, just would you mind sharing a little bit, how does one go about doing the kind of work that you do and keeping yourself sustainable, and where do you find the spirit and the energy for this?
I mean, I mean, for me personally, I'm sure James, I'm curious about James' response as well. For me, actually, James kind of said it actually already, but for me, I just put everything into the work. The rage, the trauma, the depression, the fears, it all goes into work. You know, and I mentioned James Baldwin before. I mean, he really, you know, as a journalist and writer, he really has been and was my inspiration for me to do what I do in the world, whether I'm writing or doing other work. But I just feel personally that, you know, I've always felt called to bear witness and to memorialize what we're seeing now, you know, memorialize what we've seen in the past and put it in the context of the now. I just feel like it's important that we you know, don't lose these narratives, the good or the bad, and that we try to learn from them, and that, you know, we draw from these narratives, from these stories, these personal connected stories. We draw lessons for the now and the future. I just feel like
It's very sobering, Jimmie, but I feel a real ring of truth to it when you said earlier that we won't see the end of this in our generations. You know,
We will not see the end of this.
And I feel like actually in the work we do, we witness around the world and have been immersed around the world. I see some of my colleagues from the Middle East here on the line. You know, these issues that go on for generations, colleagues in Africa. So I really appreciate, whilst it's very sobering, the honesty of you just describing how these things pass from generation to generation, the responsibility we each have in our own moment to break that cycle.
Yeah, I mean, it's I just feel like we have to bear witness for those, especially for those who come behind us, you know. Otherwise it's going to be lost. You know, we have to bear witness. We have to hold these stories. We have to like bear the pain of them and the trauma and grow out of them, you know, and draw inspiration from them. I think I said this before, and I want to make space for David. I just feel like, you know, I was talking to someone the other day, you know, I feel like especially for non-white or people of color in this country, you know, we talk about PTSD, but for I think for many people, I can say for myself at least, speaking for myself, there's no PTSD because it keeps happening over and over again. There's just trauma. I mean, there's no post, you know. I mean, I remember after Ferguson, I grew up, my mom taught in Ferguson when I was a kid. So I grew up in Missouri. I grew up next to Ferguson. And my mom taught there. After Ferguson, when Michael Brown Jr. was killed in 2014, you know, there was kind of this, you know, exhalation, like, okay, this is gonna be the last one. You know, Black Lives Matter is a reality. Things are gonna change. It's global. Black Lives Matter is like a global force. And then, you know, then people started getting killed again. It kept going. So it's like, you never really can recover. You never recover from oppression, whether you're a woman, a person of color, a female person of color, like whatever. Like you live in the trauma, and you have to figure out how to have a life, have a full life in that trauma.
Thank you, Jimmie. David, let's bring you in with a final question or comment.
Welcome. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, welcome.
Hi there. Thank you very much. Sorry about before. Well, yeah, thank you so much. And it's an honor to sort of be on this call and listening to everything. And also just that sort of just general heartfelt anger. It feels somewhat sort of slightly distasteful, the question I'm going to ask next, because it's sort of bringing things into a very, I guess, a practical view of the day-to-day and I guess the community of leaders' quests and running businesses and how applying some of that shame. And I totally applaud you for coming on this call, because it's definitely not your role to teach people like me. You know, there's plenty of places to do that. But one of the things I get to the point is curious to understand is your views on things like affirmative action, because I see many different companies and many different places do it. I work in a climate change business, and it's a very poorly, shockingly, shamefully represented business in both diversity and gender in many different areas. And I'm just interested to hear your views on affirmative action and ways of trying to create more equity and how that balances out against issues of white savior. It's clearly an issue that I'm interested in understanding how best it is applied.
Thank you, David. A super practical question. Who wants, Jimmie, do you want to?
James has this question.
Thank you. Go for it.
So,
oh, you've been beaten to it. Who's going first? You duke it out between you. Who is it?
Are you going in, Jimmie? Go ahead, Jimmie.
No. I said James got this. James has this one.
That's what I thought he said. I'll say this. You know, what we come to socialize affirmative action as meaning and what it actually is or could be or should be are two totally different things. I'm going to answer it a different way before I get back to the practical question. I think and the reason it's important, I think, to do that is because if you only discuss affirmative action and it feels like it's actually addressing an issue in a gracious way, a benevolent way that someone should be grateful for or appreciate. When you look at the timeline of America, we were 3/5 human until 1964. So you take all the different things that we talk about in history books but don't talk about from an economic perspective. Let's just start with the end of slavery. We'll give you the first couple hundred years. Let's just start with slavery. If at the end of slavery, you had actually given African Americans the 40 acres and a mule at that time that they were given in the 13th Amendment, there would be no need for affirmative action. You look at the present day value of 40 acres and a mule, it's billions of dollars today. If I'm a billionaire, I don't need help getting into college. I don't need help getting hired. I have generational wealth to live off of. Not only did we rescind that promise, we actually compensated slave owners $300 a slave for each each laborer that they lost at the time. So from 1965 to 1865 to 1964, you then had 100 years where if I was Black and I came up with an idea, do you think that I could patent that idea? Do you think that I could own land and hold on to it and build generational wealth with it? Do you think that I could profit from and pass down businesses that I built and that I scaled? So now when we get to talking about admissions into college or board seats at a white-owned corporation, we're not really addressing the issue, and we're approaching it from an area that then becomes a socialization around its affirmative action versus merit. And that's not the right framing, nor is it necessarily really adjusting the root injustice. The company that's offering the board seat profited oftentimes from years of this disenfranchisement and should also actually be offering percentages of stock or ownership of the company. Now, setting that aside, David, I'll answer your question. The perception of affirmative action is that because we believe in this merit, because this merit is actually a part of the construct of white supremacy and structural racism, to say that though this person may not be as achieving, that we can acknowledge that there's certain factors that don't allow them to achieve as much, so we're going to give them a shot. Should those things happen? Sure. But it's also a false pretense to say that that they're not achieving at the same level.
Right.
And oftentimes the reason for it was actually that you could take two folks that are achieving at the same level, and then because of other factors, the other person would get the job. So what I would challenge a company to do is, sure, hire as many Black people as you can, tip the scales, open the doors, but then make sure your culture doesn't limit their ability to succeed, and make sure that as they advance, as they go to advocate for ideas at the table. I'm sure, Jimmie, you can speak to things that you've had to fight for, different tables you've been at, where you get to the table, but then you're the only one at the table. Now the culture takes over, and now you've got to balance how much can I advocate or show strength versus how much do I have to act happy to be here.
Thank you, James. We're on the hour. I know we could keep going with this conversation. It's such a rich conversation, but I'm conscious of people's time, and that folk have probably got to go to their next Zoom call or whatever it is you're all doing with your days in this situation. I want to just say, I'm going to give Jimmie a final word in just a second to just close off, but a huge appreciation to both of you for being here. Really, really a rich conversation. I want to also say that we at Leaders Quest are very committed in all of our work, but particularly now on this subject, to really doing the work. We talk a lot about doing the work on the inside, and for those of you who want to be on that journey with us and take the bumps that come with that and the discomfort that comes with that, we welcome you. So very happy and you know, to have you all here, and very happy to follow up in different ways with your own teams and communities and organizations. And we intend to do that together with colleagues working in different Black organizations here in the States, but also people from different backgrounds around the world. So with that, a big thank you. Jimmie, I'm going to give you the final few sentences, whatever you'd like to share.
I just, you know, in my final remarks, I just say thank you, Lindsay, so much, Leaders Quest, so much. I really applaud your leadership, Lindsay, sincerely, and facilitating a conversation like this, bringing this community together. James, brother, thank you so much for your wisdom. Look forward to building and working together in the future. And just thank everyone on the call. I mean, these conversations are very challenging emotionally. You know, they can engender stronger reactions, negative and positive. I think they're critical to have happen. and even more, just even more frankly, bluntly speaking, you know, I hope it didn't come across this way. I don't think it did, but you know, these conversations aren't meant to bash white people or bash whiteness. These conversations are necessary so we can actually, you know, disrupt and dismantle whiteness, blackness, and I think this system which makes us all victimizes all of us of racism and white supremacy. I mean, we're all victimized by it, regardless of our skin color or gender. And I think it just takes these conversations to lead us to do the work individually and organizationally.
So thank you both. Thank you everybody on the line for the great work that you all do in different fields of life. Wishing you a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Thank you everyone.